Hey, how's it going everyone? My name is Keith Galley, and in this video we're going to start seeing how we can get the most out of the Synmax platform by leveraging the Hyperion API client. We're going to start by installing Python, then we'll set up the Hyperion API client, and then finally we will walk through some of the basic functionality so you can start utilizing this as a powerful tool. If you're already comfortable with Python, you can skip to this point in the video. But if you don't have Python installed, my first recommendation is to set it up using the Anaconda distribution. So we can open up a new web browser, and I'm going to just simply type in Anaconda. And it's going to be the first link that pops up. You can click on that. And then what we see here is this download button. And it already detects that I'm on a Windows system. So we can go ahead and click this. If you're on Mac or Linux, it'll be a similar process. Just kind of follow the steps. Download. The default location is fine for me in my downloads folder. Give that a sec. All right, once that's installed, you can go ahead and click on that installation. It should open up a prompt window. If it's hidden, it might be hidden behind. Nope. All right. Welcome to Anaconda 64-bit setup. Go ahead, click next. You can read through the license agreement. Agree. I'll just install it just for this local instance. That looks good. Default location. Probably just honestly keep all the default settings. So I'm going to go with this. Install. It might take a few minutes for this to actually run through all the way. All right, looks like that finished up. I'm going to go ahead and click next. Next. I don't need to see the tutorial or anything right now. I'll show you how to get it up and running. Finish. All right, so once that's installed, we now have access to Jupyter Notebooks, which is my preferred method of doing data science work. So that's how I'm going to access the Synmax API. So I can go ahead and open up a terminal window, click the start menu, type in terminal, command prompt, whatever tool you have. We can start by just trying to use the command prompt. And I'm going to type in Jupyter Notebook. Shows up as not a command, so the default command prompt with Windows might not allow you to run this command, but there's plenty of alternative solutions. If you want a nice lightweight terminal, I recommend Git Bash. If you want a more powerful terminal, you could look into getting Windows Subsystem for Linux. But one solution we can already use, even if you don't have your own preferred terminal, is we can just type in Anaconda. And so when we install Anaconda, there's an Anaconda prompt that gets installed as well. And we can now type in Jupyter Notebook here, and that will pop open our code editor, our Jupyter Notebook editor that we can run our code in. So we see it open in our home directory right now. What I recommend is let's create a specific folder to start working on our code. So I'll just call this, create a folder that's called Synmax, and we can put all of our code within this Synmax folder. And I also recommend actually opening up the Jupyter Notebook in the same location. Basically, I find it helpful to open up the Jupyter Notebook in our working directory. So this is our working directory, so we'll open up the notebook here. So I'm going to just close out of this real quick with Control-C. That's going to shut down the notebook. And then I'm going to go ahead and navigate to that Synmax folder we just created by doing CD. CD stands for change directory. And then I will go ahead and I will run the Jupyter Notebook here. And to get started writing Python code, we can go to the top right here. We can click on New, and then we can click on Python 3 kernel. I'll call my file like API test code. And one thing I do want to note, if you're familiar with GitHub, I will put all the examples that we use in these tutorial videos on GitHub. The link can be found right here. And if you ever want to see the examples or just remember exactly how to use certain commands and interact with the API in a specific manner, go to GitHub. You can look at the examples that have been used in previous tutorials there. So those will always be linked to each tutorial. Next, I just want to show some simple Python code that you could run just to make sure that everything's working properly. So I'm going to just go ahead and run print hello world. And we see that that runs the Python output hello world. So that looks good. All right, now that we have a place to run our code set up, we can go ahead and start actually setting up the Hyperion API client. So whenever you need to remember how to do something with this API client, the best spot to go is going to be the API docs. So the API docs can be found by going to apidocs.synmax.com. And within this location, there's a lot of useful stuff, especially for getting started. So I'll go ahead and click on the Getting Started. The first thing is we need to install the API client so we can run this pip installation command. One thing that's nice is if you are using the Jupyter notebooks, you can actually run the pip commands right within the notebook. So to do that, we can do exclamation point to specify that we are trying to run a bash command, and then I'm going to paste in that function. And I can do Shift Enter to run this. You don't need to use Jupyter Notebooks. If you have a preferred editor, you can follow along this tutorial just fine with that editor. All right, so we see successfully installed Synmax API Python client. Next, let's just keep going through the steps. So we also need to install a few different libraries. The nice thing about the Anaconda distribution that we've set up is that it usually has most of these useful data science-y libraries that it already comes with. But just to make sure, let's also run the pip command. We'll start with the exclamation point to specify bash command, and then Shift Enter to run that. And it looks like we already have all of that. So those things both are covered. That's good. Next, we can see if everything worked successfully by actually importing the modules. So I'm going to just copy this line as is from Synmax Hyperion, import the API client and the API payload. All right, so to confirm installation worked properly, we can go ahead and run this line with Shift Enter. And as long as you don't get an error there, that means that you've imported these libraries successfully, so that's a great start. Now let's actually start interacting with the API. So the first thing that we're going to do is set up an API client. To do that, we can just look at the docs again quickly. So it looks like there's two ways to do this. We can either set up an environment variable with an access token, or we can pass in the access token as a variable. I really recommend using environment variables. Basically, you don't ever want to commit or have in your code sensitive information. And in this situation, our access token that allows us to make calls to the API is definitely sensitive information. So how can we set up an environment variable? Well, first off, we need an access token. So if you don't have an access token already, click on the authentication aspect of the API docs, and you can get some information on getting an access token on this page. If you do have your access token, then get that out in front of you. And if you are on Windows, we can set up an environment variable using the following process. So I'm going to click my start menu, type in environment, and I will edit the system environment variables. This will open up a window that looks like this. Click on environment variables. And then what you want to do is click new down here. I usually do this on the system level. We'll give it something like Synmax API key. And then we'll paste in whatever our value is. So I'm just going to type in random characters for now. Okay. Okay. And then in our code, we now need to import an additional library. We need to import the OS library. Rerun this cell. And we can then access that environment variable by doing os.environment Synmax API key and run that. Looks like we have an issue. The reason we have an issue is that with stuff like this, we actually have to just kind of rerun the Jupyter Notebook so that all new variables, all new changes can be read in by our terminal prompt. So we are going to actually have to go ahead and open up that same window, Control-C to close out that notebook. I'm going to just close this window real quick. I'm not going to restart. I'm just going to close these pages. Open up the anti-counter prompt again. Navigate to our Synmax folder and open up that Jupyter Notebook. Always make sure you save before you close it out. I did not click Control-S to save it, so now I need to type in this code again. Synmax API key, and we can run this, import our libraries, run this. Now we see we get that random typing of characters, but obviously if this is your actual API key, now you're set up and ready to go, and you can actually put the client together. So I'm going to real quick go back to my environment variables. I'm going to paste in my actual key. You can do that as well. And then I'm just going to refresh this real quick. All right, so now finally, we're going to go ahead and set up our client. So to do that, we can say client equals Hyperion API client. And again, if you ever forget about this, just use the getting started and you know, look at one of the methods that they recommend. We're basically combining these two methods. We really like the environment variables because we don't want to have that sensitive information right in our code. So that's why we did it that way. Hyperion API client, access token is equal to os.environment access key. Run that and make sure you have those libraries installed. And as long as this runs correctly, then you have the API client. So our next step, we're making progress, is to actually test out some API functionality. And we'll start off with the regions endpoint. And so to see how we can call the regions endpoint, we can look at our documentation. We can go to, we can look at the options we have here on the left side. Probably will show how you can run some stuff. And yeah, actually right here in the getting started, we see to fetch region data, a region df, client.fetch regions, print region df. And if you're wondering where that function fetch regions comes from, well, look through the API references over here on the left. We see regions. I'm I'm going to click on that, and we would see again right here, fetch regions is a function that is available to us. And there's some more detail over here. So let's see what happens when we run that. Moment of truth. Look at that. We have a nice region data frame. So this is what's known as a data frame object from the Python pandas library. One nice neat trick if you're using Jupyter Notebooks is if you actually just do region df without a print, it formats it nicely. You can also do that same type of formatting by typing in the display keyword that's specific to Jupyter Notebooks. I don't think that that's gonna, that might give you an error if you try to do it in Visual Studio or something. But we get a nice output there. And then you can start really leveraging the power of Python and the pandas library by doing all sorts of cool filtering stuff. So we could take that region data frame and we could, if we wanted to just print out the first 5 rows, let's say, we could do .head. We could also just filter that entire data frame to maybe look at just one state. Let's say we just wanted to look at Texas. We could do region df, state abbreviation equals TX for Texas. Run that, and we'll have filtered out our regions by just Texas. This becomes very useful because you can do all sorts of filters here and really start processing this information in a meaningful way for you. If you are kind of curious to learn more about how we run these commands, definitely look into the Python pandas library. I'll try to share some resources through links attached to this tutorial. All right, let's build on this and see how we can run some of the other functionality available to us. So we can, keep looking at the API references over here on the left side. So how about we try out this frac cruise function? One thing that you'll note in this one is that when we see frac cruise, we see that there are some parameters that we'll need to pass in. So we see a start date, an end date, and a state code. So we'll want to pass these values in, especially if we only need a subset of the data. It's going to be more efficient if you're, specifying specifically that start date and end date that you care about. So we can kind of follow the same process. Let's see how we run the code. We're all good with this, but now we can actually pass in an API payload. So I'm going to just copy this line right here, pass in this line for API payload. And because we're just doing an example here, I think what makes the most sense is to make this a very small amount of data. So 2022-5/1. So we'll go from May 1st to June 25th, all of 2022. And looking up the state code Texas sounds good to me. And we need to actually pass in the function. So we can take this and go ahead and paste it in. And now let's go ahead and print out the first 5 rows of that data frame by doing head here. And with a control enter, we can run this line. And here we get the frac cruise based on the criteria we passed in the API payload, and we just are taking the first 5 rows for now, but all of it is stored in that result df. Let's do a third example, just so we kind of see a variety of different functionality that's available to us. So how about we try completions? So go to documentation, we'll look at completions. We see we have the function available to us called well completions. And one thing I do want to also note real quick is that you can see, examples of the query parameters at the bottom of the documentation, as well as what you should expect for output, along with a sample of response. So that's just helpful to know for reference as well. So take this, we'll take the API payload from the last one, might tweak it around a bit. So how about we look at Louisiana this time instead of Texas. We'll keep the same dates, and we want to pass in client dot well underscore completions, and we'll save that as completions df equals client dot well completions. So again, does that look right? Well completions. We need to pass in the payload, so I'm going to just do that quick. Payload. Hyperion API client has no attribute well completions. So you got to be careful with what you type in. Just realize that it's well completion. So just be careful, run that. And we can look at the data frame, get that information. Cool. So one thing that's super useful too is, let's say you want to take this information that you've retrieved from the API and then start processing it in another location, maybe Excel, for example. Well, we can save this as a CSV file by doing the following. So we just take the data frame name .toCSV, and we'll just call this output.csv, and we will run that. If we look within our working directory, we now see that this output CSV file is there. So you could go ahead and open this file in Excel and continue processing it if you wanted to there. So that's 3 different functions. I think you get a feel of how you operate with this API client. A lot of useful stuff there, and in future videos we will go into more depth of how you can really start building out something powerful. The one last thing I wanted to cover real quick is what happens, let's say, if you have a bad API key. So what happens if we use a bad API key? And the reason I show this is just because we want to know issues to look out for. So sometimes, if something's going, improper, just how do you know that? So to do this, we'll use another function just so we get full exposure. We'll use the rigs function. We got a start date, end date, and state code here. Okay, so we're going to set up a different client here. Call this bad client. And instead of using our actual environment variable, we'll just call this bad API key. So this definitely shouldn't work. What happens if we use that? We don't see any issues quite yet, but if we do bad client.rigs and we pass in one of those previous payloads, so we actually have a payload already saved. These variables are still saved in memory when we use it in Jupyter Notebooks. I pass in payload. And we see that we're not going to be able to get anything out of here. We see an error message that our API key is invalid. So always be kind of reading the information in this, especially if you're having troubles. You might have something like your API key is invalid, or you'll see other error messages within the retrieval within these API requests. All right, that's all we're going to cover in this video. Hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully you feel comfortable kind of getting started with this API client. In future videos, we're going to build on this functionality and really show how you can build something powerful leveraging this API. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one.